Good morning. I'm Mark Kansian, a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. This morning we're going to talk about our new report, Pacific Security in the Age of AUKUS. We're going to look at the threats and challenges in the Pacific. We're going to look at our allies and partners, the AUKUS agreement, the submarine force, and finally what can be done while we're waiting for additional submarine capabilities to come online. We're going to start with an overview of the report itself. The full report is on the CSIS website. Then I'll go to my panelists to talk about the general topic of security in the Pacific, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So when we go ahead and look at the results of the report, to do a quick sprint through what we're going to do, the report is aimed at governments and industry to give them some ideas about how they might work together to build capabilities in the Pacific. We talk about in the age of AUKUS because the AUKUS agreement has had such a major effect on U.S. posture in the Pacific and with our allies, particularly Australia. And we want to acknowledge that the study itself was funded by the Thales Group. I think the China challenge is quite recognized. We don't need to dig into that in any depth, except to say that it is rising. And although we of course hope that this will be kept as a peaceful competition, there's always the possibility of that escalating. The United States has many allies and partners in the region. Those relationships range from very close to maybe a little more distant. The one challenge for the United States is that there's no NATO to bring all these allies together. These relationships are bilateral. And then there's the AUKUS agreement itself. We'll hear more about that later. It has two parts. The first part is to create a conventionally armed nuclear submarine capability in Australia and to increase U.S. presence in Australia. And the second part is to facilitate coordination between the three partners on technical matters. I want to note about submarines in general. They're, here we say, loved by strategists. Strategists are very positive about submarines because of their stealth and covertness. They can operate inside the Chinese defensive zone in a way that surface ships cannot. What we see here on the screen are a variety of analyses of fleets from both the government and think tanks, and you can see that all of those recommendations are above the current level of the submarine force. The challenge is that the U.S. submarine force is going to decline in the near term and won't reach the current level until the 2030s and really won't start to rise until the 2040s and hit some of the target fleet sizes until even the 2050s. And the reason is that when the Cold War ended, the U.S. production of submarines scaled back, and now we're living with that trough from the reduction in construction after the end of the Cold War. So what should we do until additional submarine capabilities arrive? Well, the first thing we did is to look at insights from war games and a real war. The picture depicts a war game that was run here at CSIS, and I hadn't realized, but it has, I think, two of our panelists in this picture who play the game, and we appreciate their participation. Other think tanks and organizations have also run war games, CNAS and RAND, for example, so we looked at their results. And then we looked at some insights coming out of a real war, the war in Ukraine. So we organized these into about 6 general topics. I'm not going to go through all of the recommendations, and we don't argue that all of these are necessarily could be implemented, but we wanted to highlight some ideas that have potential for further investigation. Each one of them, of course, is quite complex and needs an analysis of its own. Making submarines more effective, for example, we note that unmanned underwater vehicles might give existing submarines a lot of leverage. They can be fired out of torpedoes, extend the range of sensors, and also improving maintenance, because a large part of the U.S. submarine fleet is tied up in maintenance and not available for deployments. Bringing more forces to bear. Two things here. One is improving C-9 command and control with our allies and partners. Always difficult. But to the extent we can do that, of course, we can leverage their capabilities. And then using contractors for things like coalition training, which is always needed, but very often is limited by the availability of military personnel. We talk about being ready to operate in a hostile environment, and the Pentagon is quite aware that a great power conflict will be different from what they've experienced for the last generation. Nevertheless, there's a cultural change that is in progress, and we want to argue to push that along. But two examples. One is about dispersing aircraft, and the Air Force, of course, is doing a lot of that already. But there's potential, of course, to do a lot more. Hardened shelters are another item, that is to protect aircraft on existing bases. And then finally, contested logistics. Again, a lot of tension there, but just beginning to wrestle with what that means. Unconventional threats. What we see here are swarming tactics that the Chinese have often used. We suggest looking at counter-swarming capabilities. Many civilian organizations have already thought about that in connection with anti-piracy. Those kinds of capabilities might be distributed. We also talk about counter-mine capabilities. Again, an area that gets a lot of attention during wartime. The United States has shown itself to be very vulnerable here, but in the budget competition often loses out. We talk about air defense, and let me say here in all of its aspects. Two I want to note here is counter-drone. That's getting a lot of attention in Ukraine, and the United States has been putting considerable effort in there in the last couple of years. That needs to be pushed along, because it's clear that drones at all levels, but particularly at the tactical level, are becoming quite ubiquitous. And finally, thinking offensively, and the services, I think, are very oriented in this direction. We wanted to put this in here just to remind everyone that even though often we will be on the defensive, at least in the initial phases of a conflict, there are always opportunities to go on the offense. And two areas, again, that we point out. One is uncrewed aerial vehicles, from the tactical up to the operational level. And then standoff sea mines. Sea mines, again, have great potential for interfering with adversary operations. The problem is getting the mines into place. They have to be emplaced by a platform. Those platforms tend to be very vulnerable. Navy's looking at ways to lay sea mines in from a distance. And with that, as a quick introduction, let me turn to our panelists. And we are very fortunate to have the panelists today. All of them have been deeply involved with Pacific security and with AUKUS. We're going to start with Charles Adel, who is our inaugural Australia chair and a senior advisor here at CSIS. He's taught at the University of Sydney, at the Naval War College. He was on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff, co-author of 2 books about foreign policy. He is an officer in the Navy Reserve, so he may get a chance to do this in person. And he holds a PhD in history from Yale University. Becca Wasser, on my left here, is a senior fellow for the defense program and a lead of the gaming lab at CNAS. Center for New American Security, also an adjunct instructor at the School for Foreign Service at Georgetown, where she teaches an undergrad course on wargaming. Before joining CNAS, she was a senior policy analyst at RAND, and she has degrees from Georgetown and Brandeis. And finally, but not least, we have Mark Montgomery, who is a senior director for the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation over at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, where the center looks at U.S. prosperity and security through technology innovation. Previously, he was policy director at the Senate Armed Services Committee, and before that served 32 years in the U.S. Navy, retiring as a rear admiral. And during that time, he had command of forces in the Pacific and was the director of operations, in Pacific Command, so has operational experience. So with that, let me turn to our panelists and give them a chance to provide their perspectives. I'm going to start with Charles Adel, and we'll go around.
Great. Well, thanks, Mark. And first of all, congratulations to you on the release of the report. It's also great to be sharing the stage, the platform, the whatever it is that we're sharing here with both Mark and Becca, two colleagues whose work is terrific, who I've long studied and really who have made an impact, I think, on thinking through the various ways that we need to field more capabilities, different concepts, if we're to have any chance of competing effectively with China. So I thought I might step back, as you said, as the inaugural Australia chair, just to provide a bit of a strategic gloss here for some of the settings for both Australia and for the United States for AUKUS. Talk a little bit about some of the challenges with AUKUS and therefore why other types of capabilities beyond SSNs are needed and why they're needed quickly. And then you can see, I think, from that why this report is likely to be so helpful and so impactful in terms of the menu of options that policymakers have in front of them. Let me start not with AUKUS, but rather in 2020. This is in Australia. They released the DSU, the Defense Strategic Update. It was released just 4 years after their last defense white paper. That's very quick in Australian defense terms, and that was really meant as a signal that strategic circumstances had changed and changed more rapidly than anyone had been led to believe, and therefore they needed to adjust their strategy too. The DSU, as it was called at the time, doesn't call out China by name. It talks a lot about military modernization in the region, but I can speak Australian, and that translates to China. And the grave concerns, I think, about not only the rapid increase in military modernization by the PRC, but also the increasingly assertive use to which it's been put. And as a result, when the then Prime Minister, different party, rolled it out, he talked a lot about the 1930s. And I am a historian by training. I love history. This wasn't history for history's sake. This is history with a policy focus, because he said if you read the history of the 30s, you need to feel haunted by the fact that democracies were insufficiently aligned, insufficiently armed, and unwilling to meaningfully push back on acts of resistance. And therefore you could see the pull, I think, of where Australian policy wanted to go, that it would align itself more closely than it had with both the United States and other member states. It would seek to arm itself more readily, and perhaps in certain occasions, when you talked about offense there, would look to meaningfully push back. So that's the backdrop to this. The DSU at the time then said, because of that, what we are going to attempt to do is turn China's anti-access area denial strategy on its head. We're going to acquire some of those own capabilities ourselves. They highlighted submarines, they highlighted long-range strike, they also called about unmanned systems, sea mines, with the idea being that they could push China further from their own shores, turning A2AD on its head. Now, that was then, that was in 2020. We've had a change of government in Australia, and the policy is the same. So the new government released the Defense Strategic Review last year, And the punchline, while underscoring both AUKUS and the desire to take some more of these capabilities that we're talking about, was really that the assumptions that had long guided Australian defense planning, namely that any major conventional conflict would come with a 10-year warning time. And that 10-year warning time would allow policymakers to align capabilities, acquisitions, and strategy gradually to get ready for that. That 10-year planning window is gone, the DSR concluded. And you can see, therefore, that the need to get capabilities, to speed up acquisition, and to speed up preparedness are now confronting Australia now, not 10 years hence. All right, so that's kind of the Australian take for why I think they're shifting to wanting more of the capabilities that you've laid out in this report, Mark. The American side is similar, but it's not the same. So the American story is obviously animated by increasing competition with China, but also an increasing desire to work more closely with allies and empower allies in ways that they haven't been empowered before. AUKUS in some ways might be the most interesting part of that story, and also the most hard to pull off part of that story. We've heard President Biden from the time he was campaigning through having taken office saying that allies and partners are America's comparative advantage. They'll sit at the heart of any American approach to strategy. That is rhetorical, but it's more than rhetoric, I think, because the idea is that with a decreasing security environment, America is incapable of doing this on its own and unlikely to deter China if it's just the United States. So AUKUS, amongst other things, though, I think really represents a shift in how America is thinking about things, that now we are going to work hard not only on that Pillar 1 capability, but to give our closest and most trusted allies more capabilities than they've had before, to kind of interconnect our systems more closely than they have before, with the idea being that there's strength in numbers, and that doing that will allow them to play a greater role. And as is a long-term tenet of U.S. thinking, if you do that, you confront threats further from American shores. So that's the thinking, I think, behind where America sits on this. I should note at the outset, though, too, that AUKUS, as great as it is, as much support as it might have, of course, fundamentally represents a bet. It's a bet with a lot of risk involved in it. It's a bet, first of all, because we don't know if we can pull it off. It's quite challenging to do. You laid out some of the challenges on the submarine production with our defense industrial base, sharing some of our closest technologies, making sure that we integrate ourselves. But it's also a bet, and I think this is where we begin to shift the aperture right towards your report, Mark, because submarines are great. We want submarines. It's a bet that giving up even some of American capabilities in the short run, which is a risk, will lead to increased production across the allied space in the medium to long term. But we don't have a deterrence problem that begins to materialize around about 2035 or 2040 or 2045. We have a challenge and a deterrence problem that is already here. And so the question then becomes, what fills the gap? What can we get in more immediately in front of us? And because AUKUS is just beginning to move from Pillar 1 to fleshing out Pillar 2, the advanced and emerging capabilities that we're going to kind of build an ecosystem, hopefully, with both the Brits and the Aussies, maybe others too, where we can kind of share concepts, share research, and field those capabilities out to warfighter hands quicker, because the dilemma that we have not solved is talking about alignment is good. I don't think that deters China one bit. And the question is, for a Beijing that are incredibly astute readers of power, what new dilemmas can we impose for them with our allies? And that's where I think some of the options that you've teed up get us into a really good menu of options type of conversation.
Great, thank you very much. Mark.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here with Charlie and Becca, and I like your report a lot. I would say a little, I'm not okay with the title. You know, I like, if I'm thinking about security in the Western Pacific, it may be an era of AUKUS, but we don't want to lose our focus on Japan. I mean, to me, they're the relationship changing the most right now. I think for the first time in a long time, one could reasonably believe that Japan would say and act as if Chinese actions, and particularly Taiwan, but maybe even the South China Sea, are existential threats to Japan. So in that regard, I think we're seeing real change, and that's why we see such significant changes in posture and capability and capacity development in Japan. But I think that builds into overall, your argument in here about allies and partners. I do love the focus on submarines. I think almost all of us have played a lot of war games. We all know that submarines are a critical, sometimes determinative factor in those games if the United States is going to do well. Of course, they're not the only thing that you need to succeed. And if you only had a good submarine force, you'd be in a lot of trouble. There's a lot of things it can't do. I do think, it's good to remind ourselves that when we speak publicly about it, when we, the U.S. government, does, we say we need somewhere between 66 and 70. And we actually have 50 going down to 40, as your report shows, 50 going down to 46. I have zero optimism or belief that we'll ever get to 66. I know we show these things, we say things like, well, we're in a 2.0 production right now. We're actually in a 1.2 production. We're paying for 2.0. We're getting 1.2 ships a year over the last couple of years. For the next 12 years or 15 years, we'll be building a Columbia class about once a year to get to 12 over 15 years. And I can guarantee you we are not going to substantially be able to alter the SSN, the attack submarine production, to more than 2.0, and we'd be lucky to get to that. So I think that those arrows are in the 2050s or 2060s, and it's very hard to make concrete determinations about things then. So I actually think we're in much worse trouble than any slides or graphs the Navy is willing to put out. So that says, well, how do you fix this? And the way you fix it is availability. How many of the 46 or 50 are available, because they're either deployed or an ability to be surged? And on submarines, that's a very explicit thing because there's things associated with their nuclear reactor maintenance and with assessments that we do to those ships, both in the reactor end and the combat systems end, that make them less flexible than, say, destroyers or frigates in that regard. Once the difference between being in port and being available is hard. And the way you do that is you fix the maintenance. And the AUKUS has accounts for that with some money for maintenance fixing. There's a difference between having money available and seeing shipyards get better and seeing maintenance get better. Those are, it's not like 3 signs of the cross to get there, but it's, some things have to go right. What we can't have is what we've had over the last few years, which is we've had 4 or 5 submarines go into 18-month availabilities and take 4 or 5 years to get done. That's completely unacceptable. There's also some poor development for the officers and enlisted on board those ships, but even setting that aside, it's the availability. So we got to fix that availability. And again, I think AUKUS will help, but it's going to take a while to get there. And so thinking of that, one of the other things you have to get at is you go right into munitions. And to me, that's the secret sauce here. And let's be clear, for 10 years, Indo-PACOM's been saying the munitions count is wrong. The production does not equal the requirement. And we're ignored. They ask for 100%, they'd get to the services, they'd say, we can make do with 80, you don't understand our forces and substitution. Then Joint Staff would say, yeah, but this other thing's important, so 60. Get to DOD, they drop it to 40% of the requests, saying, don't worry, munitions is something we can buy back quickly, not kind of recognizing that because a plant can build 100, if you only build 40 every year, eventually a plant can build 40. Right, and then finally Congress would get it and say, well, if that's where you're making your cuts to pay for other things, that's where I'll make my cuts. And it wasn't uncommon for the request of 100 to end up with a final budget appropriation of 20. And the only thing that saved us was the war in Ukraine, revealing all the problems with Javelin and Stinger. It didn't take too long for the Searchlight to go over to all these other kind of more high-end systems that we use for China and say we had the same problem there. So we're seeing fixes in LRASM, long-range anti-ship cruise missile, SM-6s, things like that. So I'm glad that's getting fixed. We do have to recognize, though, that we need a better high-low mix. So our war games, have pointed out the long-range anti-ship cruise missiles, the Harpoons. Those are kind of high-end, million-plus Maritime Strike Tomahawk. These are million-plus missiles, $1 million a shot. And the threat might be 1,000 different types of vessels out there between high-end warships that do need a high-end weapon and low-end, fishing boats, maritime militia coming across. So for that, we do need, and the DoD is not good at this because we understand high end. We understand very limited risk in delivery. We don't like to buy the medium end and lower end because there's an implication of a lot of risk to our warfighters as they deliver it. But we need to get powered JDAMs and kind of offensive drones, those kind of things going. And finally, I'd say, like, we don't even do good on systems sometimes. So 6 years ago, Congress asked the Air Force, hey, how do we get this new great LRASM missile on the B-52? Because it's only on the B-1, which is a decaying airframe, that the Air Force would like to retire. And the Air Force is like, no problem. We'll be there in 4 years. And so when they went back again last year, they said, hey, how are we doing on that B-52 LRASM? Oh, no problem. We'll be there in 4 years. I mean, no one paid for it. And the Air Force, I don't know what they're waiting for, the magic sign, but they need to get LRASM on the B-52s. And that kind of system part of the munitions needs to be fixed as well. I also like that you went into survivability. You talked a little bit about the agility in the Air Force, the agile combat employment. And what's really critical here is we need to be at about 40 or 50 bases in Japan, 10 bases in the Philippines, 4 or 5 bases in the Marianas Compact States, 4 or 5 bases in Australia. We're not there all the time. In fact, we're almost never there. But we are there on occasion. So we're checking out those bases, making sure we can fly from them. And then we have to buy something called deployable airbase sets. We need about 30 of them. We magically have them in EUCOM, European Theater, because they were bought with what's called OCO, Overseas Contingency Funds. Didn't come out of any Air Force money. Because the Air Force doesn't see this as their problem. This is a PACOM Indo-PACOM problem or a EUCOM problem. So they don't buy them. And so we don't have the deployable airbase sets we need for the Pacific. We have a small number. But again, a service is like, well, that's not my problem. Why isn't there a Bishop's Fund or some other outside thing to buy this thing that PACOM needs? Well, and we're past that kind of argument now. The Air Force needs to get on it and buy these deployable airbase sets. And then we need to exercise and practice. We're excited that we practiced at 4 or 5 Japanese airfields last year. We need to be excited when we're practicing at 20 of them a year. You mentioned electronic warfare in here. I'll just say generically a dumpster fire for the Joint Force. We're awful at it. We're starting to see the Russians were pretty good at it in Ukraine. The implication being the Chinese might be good at it. We need to get much better at it. So I like that you dealt with it. I don't know that there's an easy solution on the shelf for that. Almost every service has walked away from most of its tactical capability. The Navy still has some, but that's about it. And you mentioned deceptions and decoy. I like that. That's a lower end way. I mean, not that we ever take the low cost route, but it is a lower cost route to get things done. And you mentioned air defense, missile defense. I like that. You left off the issue I like the most, hypersonic defense. Hypersonic defense is interesting. We're spending money like a drunken sailor, $18 billion over 10 years to catch up with Russian and Chinese hypersonics after we came out of the INF treaty restrictions. I'm glad we're doing that. We're doing the right thing. Unfortunately, we're spending about $250 million a year on hypersonic defense, so about 10%. And I would just say it will be an unhealthy condition when an authoritarian regime has an offensive capability for which we have no defensive capability. And in fact, I see DoD taking risk-averse decision-making. In other words, slowing down the process on hypersonic defense so we can get more missiles in competition. This is one where I'd be getting all my chips out and I'd be betting on multiple solutions. Kath Hicks talks about how she wants to change DoD procurement. I'd say hypersonic defense is job one. Getting multiple bets out there, and maybe some would fail. That's okay. I mean, it's not okay because DoD never lets anything fail, but it really is okay. And we should be out there making multiple bets. And I'd circle back by saying I love that the allies and partners are the focus of this. I do think it's critical. Australia and Japan have really evolved over the last 10 years to a position where you can say they are the most interoperable forces with the United States, period. They've both passed the United Kingdom. They both have smaller, in the case of Australia, much smaller versions of the U.S. Navy and Air Force in their systems. And when they have built their own system, like the E-7 Wedgetail, it's not an E-7 to them, but the Wedgetail, it's very interoperable with our forces and has a lot of similar things to, say, our E-2D, so much so that we're now buying the Wedgetail as our AWACS relief. So both Australia and Japan have really done that. And now the real question is, how much access will we have in there during a war? In all our war games we play that we have it. That's nice. And then how much participation do you have? And that's where I'd say Japan's moved. Australia's there, I think, and Japan's moving very closely. Because as you saw in your war games, I think going back to your last report, there's a 30% reduction in U.S. casualties when there's a high participation by allies and partners. And that doesn't mean they have the 30% casualties. It's that you brought a bigger critical mass, better angles of attack, and you drove down casualties. That's an important, very important metric for U.S. decision makers. And the last thing I'd say is we should have some kind of like electric jolt that's installed on all general officers and DoD civilians. And when they say the words JADC2 or Joint All-Domain Command and Control, and they don't say coalition JADC2, CJADC2 at the beginning, they get jolted. Because there is no value to JADC2. There's significant value to CJADC2. We cannot, once again, build an expensive, discrete system that our allies and partners can't enter easily. They have to be there from the ground up, and they have to understand the cost from the ground up, because our things are expensive, and they're going to need to set aside the money for it. So that CJADC2 needs to be there. So all in all, a good report. I think it hits all the right metrics, that we need to make investments in, with some, minor edits that are put in there. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. And your comments about the submarines and the optimism there, I'm of course reminded of the saying in the Pentagon, you'll get well in the out years. Well, here, we'll get well in the 2040s and 2050s. Becca.
Well, I'm the caboose, I guess, coming in last, and I'll try to say things that are a little bit different, but I feel like most of my good talking points have already been stolen. So first off, you've got a great report, and I'm so heartened to see that you're advocating for so many things that I think we all collectively have been talking about over time. And really what we're trying to do here is strengthen deterrence. And I think that that is so incredibly important when we're looking at what is the goal? What is the goal ultimately of AUKUS? What is the goal of any of the investments that we might take in this interim period? So I wanted to focus a little bit on a slightly different framing for some of those near-term investments that the United States and its allies and partners could make to strengthen deterrence as we wait for that big bet of AUKUS to pay off. I think sometimes we tend to focus a little bit too much on capabilities themselves. And this, creates this idea of potentially having, a magic fix, that this one widget's going to come and save us all. That's not really how we view things, and that's not really how it works. But I think sometimes when we talk and put so much emphasis on capabilities, we undermine some of the other critical enablers that really enhance deterrence. And so I wanted to maybe just frame some of those a bit differently. Those things I think also give us a broader range of options, right? You came up with a really good menu, and having that broad range of options that we could draw from so we could deal with a wide array of potential scenarios in the Indo-Pacific, from a high invasion scenario to gray zone, as you pointed out. I think that's really going to be what enables us to successfully change Beijing's calculus to believe that any type of aggression in any form, in any location, would not be successful. So when I've been thinking about sort of these different buckets of near-term investments, I've been thinking about them in three ways. And I just want to give some illustrative examples. These are not exhaustive, and you've come up with a heck of a lot more in your report. But some of these I've drawn from my own work. I recently published a report at CNAS called Campaign of Denial, which looks at how to strengthen deterrence in this near-term period as well. So the first area for investment are what I like to refer to as the critical enablers for capabilities. Mark, you mentioned munitions right out the gate, and you are so incredibly right about that. Because what good is really having these new capabilities if you don't actually have the Schlitz to fight, right? And in all of the war games that I've run and been a part of, including the ones at CSIS, one of the big findings is we're out of preferred munitions within the first few days of a potential fight. If you extrapolate the lesson learned from Ukraine that a potential conflict in the Indo-Pacific is likely to become protracted, that becomes an even more daunting problem set. So we need to take steps now to try and reinvigorate the US and allied defense industrial bases to produce the munitions that we believe we're going to need both today and for some of those future challenges. So here it's producing a wider array of munitions, not just over optimizing for 155, but thinking about the different ranges of munitions that we might need and that high-low mix that you mentioned. I also think that more needs to be done when it comes into some of the investments in sensing technologies. And here I believe that Pillar 2 of AUKUS actually holds a lot of promise. Thinking about how we can build some additional air, ground, sea, and space sensors. That's going to be so critical for our own indications and warning and allowing us to shorten that planning time for potential conflict, but also will be incredibly useful for any queuing of the new capabilities that we might have in the future should we find ourselves in a hot fight. And then the other part that I think undergirds that is investing in some of the right C4ISR capabilities and network architecture. And this, I think, we need to think about as allied from the outset. We can't just plug in allies after the fact. If we really want to have CJAD-C2 with the C being combined and actually make it so that allies and partners can be a part of the concept, it needs to be allied from the front. And we haven't really been doing enough to think about allied architectures and to invest in them. And I think altogether, what this does is it starts demonstrating both the capacity and the capability to fight should we need. The next area that I think is really ripe for investment and sometimes takes a while to bear fruit, so again, why we need to make some preparations and investments now, it's investing in posture and readiness. So we don't know when, where, or how China may choose to aggress. And that means that we need to have a range of operating bases throughout the Indo-Pacific and have forces with high levels of readiness so we can be responsive should we see any coercion or aggression. And so I'm not necessarily advocating for permanent presence, but instead thinking about having contingency access at a wider range of bases. The current administration has made great headway in improving U.S. access in the Indo-Pacific. That's not to say that more doesn't need to be done in terms of broadening that out, but also thinking about the investments at the locations we have. So there, I think it's about the United States, along with allies and partners, and not just host nations, thinking about investments in the right infrastructure at those locations that will enable these new capabilities to operate. So thinking a little bit more about having, new runways, having those kits that you mentioned, having fuel storage at dispersal bases, and making it so that those dispersal bases are not as austere as perhaps they currently are, but allowing us to actually operate from them with these distributed warfighting concepts and ensuring that forces, both U.S. and allied forces, have the high levels of readiness to be able to execute those concepts. It also means thinking a little bit more about stockpiling. Where do you want those stockpiles to be? What do you want to stockpile? For me, if I'm thinking about it, it's fuel, it's munitions, and it's key supplies, including foods and medical supplies. Those are the things that I want to have to enable operations at near and far bases and to be able to ensure that U.S. and allied forces are able to operate, but also that civilians are protected and, if needed, have some of the medical supplies that they might require. It also means that as we're thinking about how to strengthen some of our future submarine operations, we need to think about some of the rearm and reload infrastructure, not only in Australia, but also rearm and reload at sea. And so demonstrating that we have the preparation to respond swiftly and to fight near threatened territory, I think is a very strong deterrent signal to China. And then the last area of investment is, I would probably put it as capability demonstrations, demonstrating that the United States and its allies and partners have the capability and the will to operate together. So I think we see this with a lot of exercises and experimentation that the United States can do with allies and partners. Some of these are going to be bilaterally, trilaterally, multilaterally, large, small. They're all relevant. And I think it's incredibly important that interoperability is demonstrated, not only between the United States and its high-end allies and partners, but those allies and partners with each other. So here I'm actually really heartened by some of the recent steps that Australia and Japan have taken together in terms of exercising and having different basing agreements, because that's going to enable them to work together. And to me, that is almost the highest demonstration of the capability and resolve that impacts deterrence. And then the other key part of that is making sure that in these exercises, what we're doing is we're practicing key warfighting skills. We're practicing the parts of warfighting missions that we think we might need to take in the Indo-Pacific should there be a warfight. That's not to say that you're going to be showing the ability to do something in totality, but showing that you can do a part of it is the type of thing that might give China pause in believing whether their aggression can actually be successful or not. So to me, these are just a few of the core elements of deterrence and a glimpse of what we can do in this interim period to strengthen deterrence with the existing resources that we have and making smart investments that will enable the future capabilities that we hope to have.
Well, thank you very much, Becca and panelists. I have a lot of questions that I would like to ask, but I'm going to give our audience an opportunity, and I'm going to go to some of their questions. The first one is one that's sort of near and dear to my heart, coming out of CAPE in the Pentagon and OMB, which is, how do you pay for this? And the question actually that came in was, where would you take risk, since many investments will require additional resources that might have required then some trade-offs? Where would we take risks? And I'm going to give Becca the opportunity to go first, since she went last before.
I'm used to all of this. My last name starts with W, so, a lot of practice being the last. So here, again, I think part of my emphasis was trying to see what we could do with existing resources, trying to maximize the ones that we have. So I think there's a lot that can be done. But in terms of where we can accept risk, ultimately, it's about global trade-offs and trade-offs across time. And here, I think we found some of the push and pull that you often get when you take global risk. There has been the long-awaited pivot from the Middle East to the Indo-Pacific, and I think parts of that have been successful, but we're finding ourselves time and time again being pulled back posture-wise to the Middle East. But again, it's thinking about what you can do that's a little bit different. Not getting pulled back into having permanent presence, large bases with large permanent presence. That is an area where you can accept risk in order to ensure that you have the posture that you need in the Indo-Pacific. I think that's a very smart trade. I know it's probably not a terribly popular one at the moment, but I think it's a smart trade and one where you have to look at the potential over time. I think another area where perhaps we can accept a little bit more risk is a little bit controversial because it requires making some of the, it requires us going toe-to-toe with Congress. So oftentimes, when we've been trying to make some of the trades in modernization, we're trying to retire a lot of outdated and older systems. And Congress, particularly with the U.S. Air Force, has been highly resistant to that. We've managed to make some progress this year, but I think there's a little bit more that needs to be done with retiring legacy equipment and accepting that there is going to be a little bit of risk as we wait for these newer capabilities to come online. But that requires us really changing how we interact with Congress, how the department interacts with Congress in a way that hasn't been politically palatable because everyone's got a boss, but also everyone eventually wants to get promoted.
Thanks, Mark, for asking. I definitely have some ideas on how to reduce what I trade. The first one is, it's controversial as well, but we have to, at some point, we have to acknowledge that there is not a requirement for joint forcible entry with large amphibious forces in a China war plan or in a Russia war plan. As a result, we do not need to be building 31 large deck amphibs. General Berger had this realization at the beginning of his term as commandant. He slowly got it beat out of him, but he had the right idea. They need to build some smaller ships, some landing ship mediums. They were called something else initially, but something to move the Marines before battle. Because while I don't think there's a need for large deck amphibs in a fight with China, in fact, realistically, in almost all your war games, it was return to port or sink. There is a big need for Marines. You know, the innovations of the Marine littoral regiments was big. You know, the 3rd in Hawaii, the 12th in Japan, and eventually the 4th in Guam. Those 3 MLRs can be game-changing events, along with the Army's maritime domain teams as well. I think there's real opportunity for those in theater, moving around pre-combat starting during the crisis. There's not a need for Marines on big decks in this. And if the number one thing is the number one thing, and getting ready for China is the number one thing, then I would take risk in that. And I know the Marines will push back and say, but it's so important for showing the flag or humanitarian assistance, disaster response. I would say that's pretty far down the priority list of what we need to buy against. Congress will be the Marine Corps will be the number one impediment to this. Congress will be the number 2 impediment. If you want to make real change, that's where you make it. I'll also jump in on retirements and say that Navy ships as well. We should get rid of every cruiser except the 3 that were modernized. That's being fought by the senators from the states where they're in. We should get rid of the older LPDs, which are complete maintenance hogs and preventing other ships from getting ready. And we should be allowed to reduce the littoral combat ships to the number they need for minesweeping plus a little, so down to probably 21 or 25. And Congress needs to get out of the game of micromanaging that, along with the Air Force airframes. If you made those 2 decisions, you'd get there. Final thing I say is munitions. I said high. You need that mix of high-low. If you get that right, that actually drives down cost. Low-cost munitions, by definition, cheaper than the high-cost munitions, and we need to get down into that game. But if we can do that, I think we could pay for a lot of the things we have here.
At the risk of getting you crosswise with your Navy colleagues, what about aircraft carriers?
So I think there's still a strike mission. In other words, when you play these war games, they get sunk, but they also impose cost. So I think there's value. I think they've got to get smarter about how you get long-range strike off of them. I think right now they're, along with the, like I said, the B-1 can fire the LRASM, the F-18's the other one. So I do think that there's, in my mind, there's probably a reason for them. My other issue on the amphibs is you're not building all this nuclear stuff, all these submarines we talked about, between the Virginia class, the replacement Virginia class, the Columbia class. You're talking about 60% of the shipbuilding budget, maybe 65%. I mean, you're not leaving room. And so at that point, if you don't build destroyers and frigates to defend all those things and to launch all the missiles, and to defend the carriers, you won't have them to defend the amphibs anyway. So we're building amphibs at the cost of the ships that would defend them. So to me, that's where I'd make the first cut. I mean, you can continue to have an argument. The one thing I'd say about carriers is you can continue to envision a way where they impose cost. I cannot envision a way where we're going to do a 20-knot, amphibious assault on the mainland of China or something like that.
Okay, Charlie.
So I have 3, although they might not address CAPE, because I think they point in slightly different directions where we need to be willing to assume more risk than we are, because the signals are that we're going to do it. Let me start at the overall gloss that I think it's the decision that we've made, and I think it's the correct one, that we're not going to do this on our own, and the only way that we're going to get there is by significantly plussing up the capabilities, again, of our most trusted allies, and then we move outward from there. If we actually believe that, we are revising our export controls way too slowly.
Yes.
If we actually want to be able to share technology, build capabilities indigenously in other countries, and trust that they will plus up their own plus our own, we have to move from concept of saying that we're going to reform export controls to actually having regulations that highlight and enable allied cooperation in the ecosystem. Second thing, we have to trust, as we kind of build up allied capabilities, that we don't need to have all of the maintenance ability on our own. And to me, this is the most interesting part of AUKUS, right? If we begin to look at SURF West, which is that submarine rotational force they're building up in Perth in Western Australia, there are a whole bunch of conventional subs now there. We've had some visits by SSNs, but there are plans to get as many as 2, 3, 4, or more rotating down there. And those are starting with the US and the Brits and eventually for the Aussies. An interesting and under-discussed aspect of AUKUS thus far, Mark, you alluded to this, is that it's going to plus up the Americans' ability to do maintenance by the Australians investing, taking Australian money into the US maintenance system, and then putting more maintenance facilities in Western Australia. So I think, again, if we're talking about risk, we have to move and progress this forward, but trust that those facilities are going to be there for our own assets as well as theirs. The third one is just kind of playing with the concept of risk a little bit. When I think about this, when we think about what has happened over the last several years, particularly on the lower end of the spectrum of conflict, what we're talking about is we have been risk averse and they have been risk acceptant. That's clearly true within the first island chain. We talk a lot about the fact that we have to be willing to assume more risk. We're talking about cost, but this is also true operationally, right? That everything that the Chinese do is not going to lead to escalation dynamics nor World War III, no matter what they say. And frankly, we have plenty of operational experience. I defer to Mark on this one, but both historically and contemporaneously, dealing with swarm tactics, dealing even with big boats bumping up against each other if we kind of rewind the clock to the late Cold War. And so it strikes me as being more acceptant of escalation dynamics within that first island change, while not courting it, is something that's going to make a lot of sense, because if you don't push back, you have a de facto game change. And that's why actually I would point towards your report. One of the more interesting aspects in this that I found is using those counter-swarming tactics at the lower end, I think is something that we want to both be equipping our white holes with and then pushing out to allies, particularly the Philippines, on this.
Great. And the next question that came in from the audience sort of builds on what you were talking about, Charlie, and I'll give you a chance to start. And that is the contributions of allies and partners. Are there some areas where they are particularly well positioned to contribute here to some of these concepts that we've put out or elsewhere? The United States tend to, we're sort of the elephant in the room. We tend to sort of take the lead everywhere, and on the other hand, we recognize that there were some of our allies are really very good at certain things.
Yeah. Actually, I'm going to kind of punt on that to the experts in the room on this, but let me say a couple of things. So one is on particular capabilities that they are particularly advanced on. Mark's already alluded to Wedgetail. There are things that they can do better than us, and I defer to my colleagues if they want to address which particular capabilities you've seen over time. The two other things, though, that I would say that allies do have the ability to provide not us, but all of us together, because we're talking about collective deterrence. We're not talking about individual deterrence, is location, and more locations than we have currently, and money, and more money than we have now. Again, I look at AUKUS, or the era of AUKUS, because what's so interesting about this is allies have to make their own decisions too about how much of this is going to be investments into their own sovereign systems. Totally understand that. And how much of this will be acquiring things quickly, which probably means purchasing more US kit for this. But when we think about what they can contribute, we don't have enough money. We were just talking about trade-offs. So we're kicking up more now. AUKUS, one of the things that's most interesting about this, right from the submarine industrial base, AUKUS has prompted a $3.2 billion above and beyond supplemental request. You couple that with the $3 billion that the Australians are going to put into our system, and then you add on top of that the sale price of each SSN, we're beginning to talk about serious money here. But on particular capabilities, I would defer to colleagues on this one.
Sure, I'll take a first whack. First, I want to say this about Japan. They already are a significantly more efficient defense spending country than ourselves or any of our allies except Israel. I I mean, in fact, there's no other country like Japan than Israel in terms of what the Japanese got for $45 billion a year 2 years ago was 25 ships at sea at any one time, 3 or 4 submarines at sea, 1,000 plus intercepts of Chinese and Russian planes. I mean, it was very impressive what they got for that. If you say compared to a similar spend by Germany in Europe, or if you took that multiplied by 16 and you get to the U.S. defense spending, they're very efficient. Now, having said that, they added 23% last year. They're adding 16% this year. These are significant increases as they kind of as they double their national security spending. It's not necessarily the Ministry of Defense spending, but double their national security spending over a 5-year period. It's impressive. So I think they're doing a lot. In there, I'd say the things that I value the most, they have good diesel submarines, the kind of submarines I wish Australia had bought 10 years ago instead of the French, and we probably wouldn't even be having this long AUKUS discussion. But they didn't. With a lot of U.S. front end gear and their Aegis ships, which both they have extremely functional and highly capable Aegis ships. Australia has Aegis ships. They're slightly less capable than the Japanese ones, but they still both bring that in there. And then I'd say again, the Wedgetail's a big one. One suggestion I'd have, and I think so, I do think the Australians have made good investments as well, but Japanese really good. One area where Australia could jump in there is the U.S. just figured out how to make the P-8 LRASM capable, long-range anti-ship cruise. That's going to pop out in the next 6 months or so, as a 6 or 9 months as a functional capability. We could do this. Australia has bought P-8s. So making the Australian P-8s LRASM capable introduces more airfields, more aircraft, they could buy LRASMs for them or their F-18s, and use them. So I think there's a real opportunity here for them to jump in there. So I think in those areas, that's where I rely on both those countries, both high-end, good warfighters who already are very interoperable. As I said, they've probably both passed the UK over the last 3 or 4 years as the most interoperable countries with us.
So I'm going to agree with Mark on Japanese ships and also point to the fact that they have a very robust shipbuilding industry. One of the current, different ideas that has been put out there, in part by current U.S. Ambassador Rahm Emanuel, has been for the United States to actually do more maintenance at Japanese shipyards. So that does kind of dovetail, Charlie, with the points that you were making about Australian ship maintenance as well. To me, if I'm looking at capabilities and where I think Australia can bring the most, it's really that promise on some of the Pillar 2 technologies that haven't been actualized yet. I mean, Australia is light years ahead of the United States when it comes down to quantum technologies, right? So being able to leverage that and harness that actually would give the United States an opportunity that it doesn't currently have. If you're looking more in this near term, looking at some of the advancement that Australia has made on unmanned technology, particularly in the maritime domain, but also some of the unmanned aircraft, thinking about some of those smaller, attritable unmanned aircraft that we air vehicles that we would want, perhaps maybe for Kath Hicks' replicator initiative even. Those are areas that I would want to get my hands on some of those newer technologies. And the last thing that I'll say is that, yes, there is a very good news story to tell here when it comes down to working with Japan and Australia, but it's not all a good news story. From my interviews with both members of the Australian and Japanese military and senior policymakers, as well as on the US side, in our conversations, there's a huge gap that comes up when it comes down to some of the genuine strategic and operational planning that we need to have that would allow us to actually use these capabilities in a combined way. There is still a bit of a holdup on some of that frank conversation and how we would sequence some of our activities that I think still needs to be done and still needs to be really had in this open manner. So we're getting there. We're moving toward that, but we're not quite there yet. And I do want to just throw that out there to kind of give us a little bit of pause and say there's still a lot of work that needs to be done.
I jump on that for one thing. Is to say I think Keen Edge at the end of this month, which is are historically our largest U.S.-Japanese bilateral kind of high-end strategic operational war planning exercise where we show a lot of leg to each other about what our plans are, is this year adding in, at the Japanese request, Australia. So I think, I do think those are doable. And in our Talisman Sabre and other exercises with the Australians, we show that, and they've added in the Japanese. So I do think it's moving along. I worry at the slightly above that, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that kind of decision making. I mean, the only thing harder than one democracy deciding to take action in a crisis and potentially go to war is two democracies trying to simultaneously take action in a crisis and go to war. So I think we really need to work on that. I jump on one other thing. The Japanese just put out, just now have a plan for a PGA, a permanent joint force headquarters, right? That they're going to have done by end of 2025, but they've already got a temporary one standing up in Japan, and to serve as a COCOM. The Australians did this more than a decade ago with their JOC, Joint Operational Command. Having them have a COCOM that can control forces, so you don't have to negotiate with 3 or 4 different services, is going to go a long way, I think, to addressing this. And particularly the Japanese had a highly siloed system that made it interoperability and coalition operability as hard as it did their own joint interoperability. And often I think the U.S. and Japanese navies are closer than the Japanese Navy and Air Force. So breaking that down will be important. I think that'll happen significantly over the next 12 to 18 months.
Great. A question came in about munitions, and that's come up a couple of times, particularly from Becca and Mark. So I'm going to come back to that. And the question was about surging munitions and stockpiles. We've seen that a lot in Ukraine, where we've used our stockpiles and now we're getting short. We're trying to surge. Surge turns out to be pretty difficult. So on the other hand, the wargaming that we've done and that you've done shows clearly we need lots of munitions. So what's the best approach there? Surge, stockpiling, whatever?
I think all of it goes hand in hand, right? Mm-hmm. You can't really have one without the other. Right now, we are struggling with very brittle supply chains, and that has made it difficult for us to be able to have the right equipment, right supplies, right workforce in place to be able to surge. Some of the holdup has also been these long lead items that take a while to acquire. When you factor in the fact that we also have a bunch of supply chain holdups because we have just these really small, almost 4th, 5th, 6th tier suppliers that make one component, it holds everything up. So we really need to take a look at the U.S. defense industrial base to think a little bit more about how can we size it to make it work for great power competition, to make it work for what we think we might need for U.S. warfighting in the future and for our allies' warfighting. So what does that mean if you want to have a DIB that has expanded capacity, that is more resilient and is more responsive to some of those global dynamic changes? We haven't really done enough thinking through all of that. And I think what our answers would be in each of those categories would have different characteristics for the defense industrial base, particularly when it comes down to munitions. Again, my biggest fear right now is that we and our allies may be over-optimizing for 155 munitions and the things that are currently high in demand, not so much thinking about how some of our restarting lines, setting up new lines, might come at the expense of producing some of the longer range munitions that may be more relevant for a potential fight in the Indo-Pacific. That's my current fear when it comes down to munitions, more so than, is surge capacity really right at this moment?
First, I attach myself to everything Becca said. I think that's very accurate about our defense industrial base of munitions. I am very specifically thinking we have to stockpile. I mean, one of the reasons we've been successful in Ukraine is a border with Poland, Romania, Slovakia. There is no land border. a delivery of weapon, as you saw, I think one of the war games you had me as a Blue Force commander, you forced me to try to do resupply, and basically that was like how many squadrons of F-35s and C-17s do you want to lose each round? There will not be resupply after heavy kinetic start, not for quite a while. So we need to stockpile on Taiwan. Now, Congress saw this in the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act, under that Taiwan Enhanced Resilience Act. Very specifically, it said you can put $100 million worth of gear for 3 years of munitions in, and they added Taiwan to the list of Pacific spaces. DOD's done nothing about that. And Congress didn't appropriate for it. It wasn't necessary the way it was written, but that would have been helpful. Then this year, there was something called a War Reserve Supply Allies Taiwan. It's something called Warsaw. We have one in Korea, one in Israel. We need one in Taiwan. And what this is presetting the munitions in there. That either U.S. forces like a Marine Littoral Regiment, you could put naval strike missiles in there for them, or you could put in harpoons or other missiles, javelins, man pads, things like that for the eventually 155s when we get that turned around for the Taiwans to pull from. Neither one of these is being done, and one of them is not even authorized, the Warsaw T. So to me, getting that stockpiling right, you can see this from Ukraine. This is not like, this is not, breaking the Rosetta Stone. We know we need this. Go ahead, get these things authorized, start flowing what munitions you have, and as the defense industrial base gets healthy, flow in the rest of the stuff.
Just 3 points to not associate myself with my colleagues. No, I'm in violent agreement of what we'd heard, but I would say, as we've seen kind of the brittleness of supply chains, not only for COVID, but obviously what we're talking about in the munition space because of Ukraine, I think we have to underscore that the world and therefore the U.S. as well are moving away from efficiency and towards redundancy. So we have to be willing to take risk to buy more things so that we have more things around. Point 2, when this point was emphasized earlier, if I'm sitting in Beijing and I think about things that might give me pause, more fuel and more munitions stockpiled and available are the 2 things that ring my bell quicker than anything else in more locations. So it's easy to talk about. It's a little harder to do, but it's pretty clear exactly what we need to do if we want to actually underscore that deterrence. Third point, because you were talking about Ukraine, I couldn't agree more. To my mind, there's another interesting thing that flows out of the Ukrainian example, and it's really the Zelensky example. If we think about how well prepped he is for every one of the 5, 6, 7 Zoom talks that he gives per day, right? When he zooms in to Australian National University or the Australian Parliament or the University of Sydney, if he does this over in Brussels, he has an exact list and inventory of just what he wants each one of those countries to supply him from what they have there. I'm really interested to see with the Taiwans what their list and what their research looks like from other countries other than the United States. The conversations that I've had generally are, what would you actually like from others? And the answer is international support for us to have viability in international institutions. Absolutely. I would also like them to be doing a little better research and reaching out and saying specifically what type of things that they want from whom, because I think that actually makes the question a little bit harder for our allies and friends.
I'll just be thrilled if their Zoom can work. I think the Chinese are going to probably do a slightly better job than the Russians at knocking down satellite communications.
We've talked a lot about partners and allies, and we've highlighted the Japanese and the Australians as being particularly capable. And my question about other allies and partners is, first, are there any hidden gems that maybe don't get the attention they should? And are there any problem children that we really need to help out and because of the difficulties they're facing? So I'll start with Becca.
Great. I'm going to not answer the second part of your question because I would like to go to a range of countries. So we haven't talked a lot about the Philippines, and I think the Philippines do deserve a bit of attention. One, in terms of the enhanced access agreements that we saw in the last year, which had built on to the existing EDCA sites, to have new EDCA sites. I mean, that has opened up a totally different array of potential U.S. posture and operational plans, and I think that that should not be understated. I think the other area that we've seen is the Philippines moving closer to other U.S. allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific, right? We've had, there are some talks between Japan and the Philippines at the moment, and I think that that is showing a lot of good progress. So I think the Philippines deserves a little bit of a shout out. I think there is, of course, a grain of salt that we need to, add into the discussion about the Philippines. There does tend to be a bit of political unevenness within their own domestic politics. And so that's something that we need to be mindful of, because this has actually gummed up U.S. access in the past, and something that we just need to have in the back of our minds. Obviously, we've also seen great progress when it comes down to Japan cooperating with the Republic of Korea. I think, if we are thinking about, again, a wide array of different scenarios, both high and low end, thinking about the ways in which being able to have broader cooperation with Korea, perhaps maybe in missile warning, perhaps in being able to draw equipment that is already pre-positioned in Korea for a broader Indo-Pacific contingency. These are things that I think are incredibly useful, and that we're starting to make progress on, not only on a bilateral basis, but also a trilateral basis. And that really has been a sea change from what we've had in the past.
Mark?
Thanks. So first, we do need to, and we've all said it, but Australia and Japan and their alliance with us, and their bilateral alliance with us, are absolutely the most significant contributors to deterrent to improving deterrence in the Western Pacific, and it's something that is measurable by the Chinese. And I think every exercise we do, especially as we go trilateral, that from the tactical to strategic level, has to drive Chinese decision making and recognition that the more desirable case, which is deterring an attack, is likely. And so, really, the administration deserves a lot of credit on AUKUS, and there's a lot of credit for its really detailed work with Japan over the last 3 years. In both cases, that's really contributed towards deterrence. If I look at other countries, I do think Philippines is the most important. The use of the Luzon sites, exercising at them, using the airfields, leaving equipment behind. I think that's all critical. Whether we'll have access or not in a war will probably be driven, or in a crisis, will be driven with how it plays out. But I think more and more likely, that we'll have access. I don't think we worry too much about Philippine contribution to anything other than a Philippine contingency, but access is important. I do on Korea. Korea's an important ally. Their problem is North Korea. I don't think they'll ever be involved in anything involving China elsewhere, because the minute there's any indication of that, the Chinese will wake up their one ally, true treaty ally, North Korea, and they'll rattle the cage and keep everything there. And I don't think we'll get anything off the peninsula. I mean, it'd be nice if we could, but realistically, at this point, for planning purposes, I wouldn't rely on any of that. But I'd rely on Korea to still be a strong partner, and I certainly appreciate the development of the trilateral there. Again, because of the Biden administration's commitment to trilateral meetings, ridiculously nearly 100+ meetings over 3 years, is what drove us to that level of cooperation. So credit to them. But Australia and Japan are the backbone of the alliance structure for us in the Western Pacific, and they're the reason that, if there's any reason for the Chinese to take pause, it's that.
Great.
So as we begin to wrap, we should disagree with each other actually now and then, so I'm going to disagree with Mark. Only to say that we've already gotten things out of the Koreans that we didn't think that they would be getting out, and that actually is for Ukraine. They've actually been providing more munitions than the European allies have. I know you would agree with that one too, but look, you guys have stolen my thunder when we talk about both the rocks and what they may or may not be able to do, certainly on the production side of things. Obviously the Philippines. Let me note 2 or 3 others. So first of all, as we're still negotiating what the supplemental is actually going to look like, we have something clearly in front of us which needs to be locked down. The administration has gone through great efforts to renegotiate and extend the COFA agreements out in the Pacific. If we talk about access to the Western Pacific, if we don't have Marshall Islands, if we don't have Palau, you can't even begin to imagine how we would do this. We've now negotiated it. It's $7.2 billion for 20 years of access that we get. If we can't fund this, this is a bigger strategic own goal than our not signing TPP in the first place. So one, that is an opportunity and a giant risk that's right in front of us. The other thing I would say is, as Ukraine has evolved, we now have more players in the game. And I look particularly at the Nordic states who produce things, yes, always concentrated on Europe, but we begin to think about what other production capabilities begin to flow. Not that they're going to put out there, but there is more production there in some discrete areas than we have had previously. The third one that I'd simply say is we haven't been talking too much about Pillar 2, which is still more sketch than it is a reality. As the sketch has become a little bit more clear, in December, we now have 8 discrete lines of effort, 6 that are actually functional, 2 that are kind of information sharing. You can see that a variety of other countries, particularly starting with allies, are what I would call Pillar 2 curious. And New Zealand is actually towards the top of the list on there. Now, Pillar 1 for a country like New Zealand is not going to happen. They're an anti-nuclear country. Pillar 2, particularly on some of the space elements, is looking more interesting, particularly with the new government in New Zealand. So that's one that I would chase after a little bit because I think we have an opportunity there.
I think New Zealand needs to do a few more push-ups on their China policy before I 100% go in on that. I think they are not Australia in that regard. They have not had that kind of that reckoning to the same degree as Australia. So I agree they could get there. They are Five Eyes, but I think their approach to China has over the last 15 years has not been as rigid as we would expect.
I would say no argument on that, but a Five Eye treaty ally, or not a treaty ally,
I was gonna say.
Five Eye ally, kind of ally, that wants to contribute, that is willing to put money and get capabilities into warfighters' hands as they think through what their China policy is nothing to sneeze at.
And they have P8s. We're not opposed to them.
Okay, we're essentially out of time, but I wanted to do a lightning round here. Give each of you 60 seconds to talk about either reinforcing something you've already said or something that you want to put on the table that hasn't come up yet. So, Becca.
All right. The things that matter in terms of strengthening deterrence in the Indo-Pacific in the near term, it's the deeply unsexy things. It's the things that we don't want to point to. It is things like stockpiling. It is things like increasing munitions production. It is things like holding, exercising, and practicing warfighting skills. That's not necessarily the stuff that we want to talk about when we're thinking about these new shiny capabilities, but those are the things that actually matter if you're trying to alter a deterrence calculus of a would-be adversary.
Mark.
Thanks. So I think we sometimes get fixated on 2027 because Admiral Davidson said it. That was at the time where he saw their Chinese capacity increasing past some assessed amount of ability to invade Taiwan successfully. What he didn't say afterwards and probably should have is, but we all get a vote on this, right? China may not spend as much on their defense. The United States could spend more. Taiwan could do more. Japan and Australia could do more. Some of the other countries we mentioned could. And that's happened. The United States has done more since then. Our allies and partners have done more. And we've moved that to the right. And so it's important because, we need to not overreact. We need to build a deterrent vision that works today, it works in the midterm, and then is invested for the long term. And we can't get overly fixated on 2027. And I would say one other shout out. We haven't mentioned them by name, but the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party with Representative Gallagher and Christopher Moore as chairman and ranking, has done a really fantastic job on security issues over the last year, and just put out a very good job on very good report on economic security issues to address. So I'm excited to see that play out over the next year. So I think I'm optimistic. And last thing I'd say is I have a son about to select a ship, and he's excited to go to Yokosuka, Japan, and I'm not unexcited for him to go to Yokosuka, Japan. So that tells me that should tell you that I think it's a safe place to operate for the next 3 or 4 years.
Great. Charlie, you get the last word.
That's a great point to build on. So one, I want to say that while we're talking hard military capabilities, even unsexy hard military capabilities, there's a whole nother conversation with the China Select Committee has really prompted us into about economic tools that we have and that we might build into our belt along with allies. Point one. Point two, I'm going to give you your homework, Mark, because this is a terrific report, but there's obviously a follow-on report in here too, which is you didn't preference or weight any of these capabilities, you just listed them. And I think the very good work that needs to happen after we have this range of options in front of us is for each of these discrete capabilities that we've discussed or even operational concepts, what do we actually think that they have the ability to accomplish? What do they provide the U.S. or a particular ally that they don't have now? And most important and hardest to decipher, how do we think having that would affect Beijing's calculations? Because once you have the capability, then we have to think about how you're going to use it.
Well, thank you very much to my panelists. The full report is available on the CSIS website, and thank you all for joining us this morning.